Welcome to this rapid revision video looking at Elizabethan attitudes to the poor. Firstly, let's consider the categories of pauper that Elizabethan people believed existed. Elizabethans were not entirely unsympathetic of the poor. A local tax, known as poor rates, paid for a very basic form of welfare, poor relief. This was for those who could not work rather than those who avoided it. Christian duty also meant some better off people wanted to give to the poor charitably. In simple terms, the poor were divided between, firstly, the impotent or deserving poor. These are people who could not work. It might include the elderly, the sick, or the disabled. The second category was the able-bodied or idle poor. Idle here meaning basically lazy. These are people who could work in theory, but weren't for whatever reason. It might include the unemployed, the homeless, but also vagabonds and vagrants who were travelling beggars who would go from town to town begging as a way of supporting a lifestyle. Under laws introduced by Henry VIII, vagrants risked being whipped or even executed. Poverty in towns was especially noticeable in times of economic crisis, as rural workers came into the towns seeking work. 1563 to 4, 1568 to 73, and 1586 to 88 were all bad years for the vital cloth trade, often due to embargoes or bans on trade with the Netherlands, which was under Spanish occupation. Laws to support the poor were passed to coincide with all of those times, in 1563, 72 and 76, which happened to be the year of the Spanish Fury. I've got details of that in a previous video. We'll be looking at those laws in detail later on, but firstly we're going to consider urban poverty. This was a growing problem, and poverty in towns was only getting worse. Elizabethan society had a strict social hierarchy. Vagabonds and vagrants were travelling beggars who went from town to town begging. The upper classes feared them, as they were outside of the hierarchy, having no lord or master to answer to. They often also lived outside of the law as criminals to support themselves. This got worse as more poor people flocked into the cities. The main reason for this we've covered in our rural poverty video, but they do include people who had lost their land to enclosure or other reasons that caused rural poverty that I covered before. There were also economic recessions. These might affect the whole country. This was where many people went out of business, and trade embargoes with Spain often meant the loss of the wool trade. All of this caused poverty and indeed increased urban poverty. These poor would not be granted access to the towns, so they built shanty towns outside. Like the vagabonds, this put them beyond the rural social hierarchy, but also beyond the hierarchy of the town and the town authorities. However, most of these people could work, at least in theory, if there was work available. Some believe that they were simply lazy, but Elizabeth's government began to recognise that this was a problem, and a problem that they might be able to solve. So what did the government actually do, and did it help? Helping the poor was a local issue, but times of economic hardship were often national. While local officials collected poor rates and distributed poor relief, increasingly there was a need for a national approach. There's going to be quite a lot of information appearing on the screen on this slide, so you might want to make it full screen. The idea of having a national approach to poverty is quite a modern idea, recognising that unemployment was a national problem and that the government shouldn't punish blameless people for their circumstances. This approach also helped to deter unrest. People were more likely to stay loyal to the government if they felt helped, but also helped to deter vagrancy. Vagabonds would be whipped and returned to the parish of their birth if they were caught begging. This was seen as fairly normal practice, even if it seems brutal to us today. Between 1563 and 1576, coinciding with economic recessions, a series of laws were passed to deal with the issue of poverty. The first was the 1563 Statute of Artificers. The aim was to ensure the collection of poor rates and poor relief collected from people within towns, or artificers. People who refused to pay poor reliefs, or rather poor rates towards the reliefs, could be imprisoned. Also, officials who failed to organise the poor relief or collect the poor rates could be fined £20, which was a huge sum at the time and would probably bankrupt them. Then there was the 1572 Vagabonds Act. The aim here was to deter vagrancy. Vagrants faced whipping and could have a hole drilled in each ear as a deterrent. On the second offence, they would be imprisoned, and on the third offence, they might even face death. But on the more progressive side, this also established a national poor rate or poor tax. This was done for the first time, and this helped the impotent poor. These were people who couldn't work. Justices of the peace, too, kept a poor register, and they were to find work for the able poor. This was further developed in 1576 with the Poor Relief Act. The aim here was to identify the able poor and to help get them into work. Justices of the peace, who had previously got a register of those who could work, now supplied wool to those people to allow them to make cloth to sell and to try and support themselves. Anyone who refused the help of getting this wool would be sent to a prison for the poor called a house of correction. Don't mistake this for the workhouses, they came somewhat later. All of this, the wool and the materials, would be funded by poor rates. So let's have a look at what the impact of this was. Quite a lot of information on this one too, so again, full screen might be an idea. Some changes had positive effects and the poor were better cared for, but others were less effective. Some of them were seen as cruel, and actually not every town enforced them. Records show that in some towns, only 10% of convicted vagabonds were whipped, as the law required. Some were even given money and sent on their way. This might be out of Christian charity, but it was often cheaper and less hassle for the parish too. But perhaps the biggest impacts were a recognition that poverty and unemployment were genuine problems, and that people weren't always to blame for them. Also, they recognised that the able-bodied poor were not always lazy. And there was also now a national framework for collecting and distributing poor relief, enabling people to stay in the town or village. This remained the case until poor law reform all the way in the 1800s. However, some areas were more generous to the poor than others. Ipswich, for example, had by 1569 set up a school and a hospital for the poor and a prison for those who refused to take poor relief, like the House of Correction we mentioned earlier. Other areas like London recognised problems like abandoned babies and provided specialised help for these groups. Our final points then to summarise. Elizabeth's governments tried to deal with the issue of the poor. Urban poverty and vagrancy became increasing problems as the economy was affected by war with Spain and changes in rural society. The 1563 Statute of Artificers enforced the collection and distribution of poor relief. The 1572 Vagabonds Act punished vagrants, but aimed to provide work and protection for poor people too. It also established a national poor rate. The 1576 Poor Relief Act aimed to provide work for those who could do it and punish those who refused. However, the impacts were inconsistent. Some areas were better than others at providing poor relief. Other areas ignored the laws to an extent, taking more pity on the poor, maybe out of Christian charity, maybe simply because it was cheaper. So that's the end of this lesson. I hope it's been useful to you, and if it has, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. But for now, goodbye.